Now, for tonight's author feature, Robert Kolker is the New York Times bestselling author of Lost Girls, named one of the New York Times 100 notable books and one of Publisher Weekly's top 10 books of 2013. As a journalist, his work has appeared in New York Magazine, Bloomberg Businessweek, the New York Times Magazine, Wired, GQ, O Magazine, and Men's Journal. He is a National Magazine Award finalist and a recipient of the 2011 Harry Frank Guggenheim Award for Excellence in Criminal Justice Reporting from the John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York. Bob lives in Brooklyn with his family. We are so thrilled for you to join us tonight, Bob.
Hello. Hi, Linda, and hello, everybody here on the Zoom. I'm really thrilled to be talking with you all about Hidden Valley Road tonight.
Welcome, Bob. And in conversation with Bob will be journalist Joselin Linder. Joselin is the author of The Family Gene, a memoir about her family's fatal genetic disorder that opened a window onto the exploding field of genomic medicine. Joselin is a regular contributor to the New York Post, and her work has also been featured in This American Life, Morning Edition, and Life of the Law. Joselin also lives in Brooklyn. Joselin, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Hi there, it's so good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Welcome. And thanks to all of you for joining us this evening. Now a warm welcome to Robert Kolker in conversation with Joselin Linder.
Hi, Joselin.
Hi there, I'm very excited about this.
Yeah,
Yes, I want to start by just saying how much I have loved this book. Like what a pleasure that this is what I get to read in order to talk to you tonight. And also that I get to talk to you about it now. That seems so exciting. And so my first question for you is, this has been a really weird tour, right? This whole book tour. Yeah.
Exactly. There was the fear that no one would want to read any books right now, given the crisis. And then there was elation that the book had been singled out by Oprah's book club. And then there was the very strange experience of talking to Oprah and to other people from home, and then, having book events, and then the computer goes off and I go to the kitchen and wash a dish. That there's not a lot of touring or anything like that. It's all happening from home. So it's certainly nothing to complain about and a lot to be grateful for, but very, very peculiar.
Right. It seems like on the one hand, like, you can't go places, you can't meet people in person, but on the other hand, maybe you get an opportunity to find a wider audience just because everything's virtual and anyone can come.
It has been very inspiring. From the very, very beginning, booksellers, mental health organizations, colleges, graduate schools, community organizations, JCCs, they've all wanted to do virtual events with authors, not just me, but other authors, and book clubs also, just 10 people in a room saying, let's Zoom with the author. And I've gotten emails from all of those folks saying, let's do it. And I say yes to everyone, and everybody else does too. That the publishers love it, the authors love it, but most importantly, the readers are into it, which is just great that everybody's willing to experiment this way.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, I definitely think, yeah, I mean, for me, like I was reading a lot of fiction, and then, I think I was thinking nonfiction would be too much. Like the world is way too fictional right now, whatever's happening. So, but then having the experience of reading your book, I was like, oh, interesting. Maybe I do need to read some nonfiction. Because it was such a good experience for me. So
yeah, I started small in the quarantine, definitely with shorter stuff, and then I said, wait a minute, I'm here. I have the time, I have the space, and I started to hit the doorstop books for sure. I started to do those as well.
Oh, I love it. Yeah.
Something.
All right, so I'm going to start with the most important question first, because it feels like I need to just start here. And you already mentioned it, but can you please tell us about Oprah?
Well, I mean,
did you get a car? What happened? Was she like, here's your car, here's your book club?
Well, this is a nonfiction book, and very, very few Oprah's book club books are nonfiction books, so it wasn't on my radar. I didn't go to bed at night while working on the book thinking, maybe she'll pick me. So it was really out of the blue. But the call certainly came at just the right time, just as all of America was shutting down, and I was wondering how the book would make an impression. So my agent and my publisher both knew about it before me, but they did not want to tip me off because they were afraid that if it fell through, it would destroy me, which it probably would have. But so they were waiting for her to call me directly. And there was a 2 or 3 day period where they were just sitting there waiting for Oprah Winfrey to call me. And even one morning, my agent called me for no particular reason, just to say hi. And I was like, this is weird. And I think he was trying to make sure that I was home and ready to take calls because he thought the call would happen that day. And when she did call, I just burst into laughter because I then realized what was happening, and also was super relieved at how wonderful it was. I should say, like, in a note of seriousness, the family who spoke to me for this book, they really went out on a limb. They had been thinking for years about going public with this and talking about the pros and cons. And the fact that someone like her and with a book club like that was able to validate their decision was just a wonderful thing. And for me to get that news before the book went on sale was just a wonderful thing as well. Just for me to know that the chance of this backfiring and hurting the family was now next to nothing because we had this kind of support. So it was fantastic that way.
Yeah, I love that. That's awesome. That's, yeah, totally. I think anytime you're writing about other people, there's just a whole different energy. Like everything that happens, you're excited for yourself, but there's also this like, oh, but I'm so glad for the people that I was writing about. Oh, yeah.
Certainly.
So speaking of the family, how did you come across them? Like, so I had like a chicken and egg thought. I was like, were you thinking about writing a book about schizophrenia and happened upon this family, or was it the family you'd heard about?
Well, I've certainly done that before with magazine stories. I've reverse engineered where I've thought there's an issue I'd like to write about and let me find the perfect story to hang it all on. But that did not happen this way. I did not think for my next book, I'd like it to be about schizophrenia. Instead, what had happened was that over many years, just by happenstance, I had built up a real world of experience writing about ordinary people who were going through extreme circumstances and writing about the difficulties in their lives and their emotional journeys. And then I ended up hearing from an old editor of mine, John Gluck, who was at New York Magazine with me for many years. He was old friends with the Galvin family, with the youngest members of the family, the 2 sisters. He went to high school with the youngest of the members of the family. We're talking about 12, for people out there, we're talking about a family with 12 children, born over 20 years. And so the youngest one, Lindsay, went to boarding school, and my editor went to boarding school with her, and she was not interested in talking about her family or her life while she was in high school. But over the years, he learned the gist of it. And then one day, the 2 sisters came to him and said, we've been thinking for decades about the right way to let the world know about our family, and we aren't sure how to do it. We've decided not to write a memoir. There's too many siblings, too many other people's stories, too much science, too many medical records to sift through. Do you know of a journalist who could write independently about this? And my editor, my old friend, thought that I'd be a good match for it just because he knew I had a way of writing and reporting very intimately about people's lives in a way that was sensitive, not necessarily as an advocate, still as an impartial journalist, but as a compassionate reporter. So that was the beginning, but it took a year because I wanted to talk to everyone in the family and make sure that they were really on board. It took a year of talking with them all because this is private medical information. I didn't want anybody to be upset about the idea of a book. And so at the end of the year, I then had a book proposal together and was confident that I was able to tell everyone's story because I really wanted everyone's point of view, including the mentally ill siblings' point of views.
Great. So how was it getting approval from them? Did it feel like you were able to from most of them?
Well, there were 6 of the 12 children were diagnosed at one point with schizophrenia. 3 of them are deceased. The other 3 are in care situations. So they aren't in straitjackets in maximum security settings. They're in assisted living, or one was living independently at the time. And so I met them all, talked to them all. They all were interested. I mean, they all are at different levels of cognition, but they all were fine with it and certainly knew who I was. But the best thing about that was that I was determined that this book wouldn't be a monster movie. I didn't want it to be about like a body snatcher situation where one by one each of the siblings who become sick is suddenly becomes sick, and then that's the last we hear from them. I wanted to make sure that
a caricature of mental illness, or I don't think you did at all. I think that you accomplished that for sure.
right, and I didn't know how that would pan out. So talking with them, I was relieved because they are their own people. They are very clearly people who are manifesting their illness in different ways based on the people that they are and how it all panned out for them. So I was very confident once I talked to them that I'd be able to write about them as people and not just as cookie cutters, because it's really not a cookie cutter illness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that actually, so my next question is, I felt like, and I think this is actually really true also of Lost Girls, you have a really great way of writing in the point of view of a woman. I mean, which I think you do in this book very much, because I do feel like it sort of ends up being Lindsay's book. Her name was Mary when she was really little, but like it sort of starts with Mary and then ends with Lindsay. I just kind of feel like the arc sort of fell on her shoulders. But I have to admit, I do feel like you kind of do it with every sibling. Like you manage to really give a lot of, I feel like I have a familiarity with each of them as I go. But I am wondering, do you have a different method when you write women, or when you write from the point of view of women, or is it different for you?
I think my goal is to talk with people about what they're thinking and feeling at every moment of their story. And it has happened with these last two books that the people whose stories end up popping out are female. I don't feel as I necessarily have a different approach with females, and I've written about men before in magazine stories, but it is interesting that way. Perhaps it's that they are more open and more willing to talk about their minute-to-minute emotional journeys and what's happened with them, and maybe that's just I'm just able to talk to the people who are most willing to talk about such subjects. It's possible. I do think that was the goal with this book, was to get every living family member's point of view and to get everybody's rationale to sort of understand what was happening, including the mother of the family, Mimi Galvin, who died in the middle of reporting the book. I have her perspective as well, much of which came from interviewing with her, but much of which also came from talking with other people as well. There were two big questions with a book like this. The first is, how is it that a family with 12 children has 6 family members developing schizophrenia? How does this happen to just one family? And all of the terrible dramas that happen in conjunction with that. And then the second question is, how do they remain a family? And so I think Lindsay became a focal point because she embodied both of those questions. She was, of all the well siblings, she was the one who came back and became the caregiver for her sick brothers. And so she's the one who helped answer that second question. And that's why she sort of became the spine of the book, the person who you see it a lot of things through. But I did want it to be an ensemble book too. There are detours where there's a chapter about Michael and his commune, and Margaret and her life and how she comes back to the family on her own terms. There are a lot of ways of looking at this family, and I hope to provide a lot of them besides Lindsay as well.
Yeah, I was gonna say I love Michael. Like in some ways, he was my favorite of the siblings. I loved his artistic point of view and his sort of one flew over the cuckoo's nest sort of attitudes about crazy, being crazy. And I guess I had a question. Let me find my question about him. Oh yeah. So do you sort of feel like after having spent time with this family and spent time with this book, you have a different idea of what it means to be crazy? Or what it means to be mentally ill?
I had a lot of preconceived notions that got completely undermined by what I learned as I was writing about this book. I thought that I'm 50. I came up in the 80s and 90s at a time where mental illness was understood to be a brain chemistry issue, and that if you found the right pill, you could regulate it. And with bipolar illness or anxiety or depression, the idea was to sort of find that. And I thought that schizophrenia was the same way. I thought that there were meds that if you were on the right medication, then things could be okay. But what I learned is that it's not like that for schizophrenia, that the meds are basically the same meds that people have been taking for 50 years. that they are good symptom suppressors, but they don't turn back the clock for patients. They don't make them better. They just make them more manageable as psychiatric patients. And it's a kind of a slow moving tragedy for those patients, although it's also miraculous in that things are a little more controllable. It's also sad that there's been nothing better, no way of really helping these people have more functional lives. And so that was a real eye opener for me. And and then the notion of schizophrenia itself, of course, is not what the popular imagination suggests. It's not a split personality. You aren't creating an imaginary universe that you live in. You're detached from what we see as reality, but that can manifest in any number of ways. You can have delusions or hallucinations, but there's also catatonia and paranoia and any number of other ways. And each brother sort of brings their own thing to it. So you see the whole spectrum with a family like this. And then there's the whole question of where it comes from. And nobody's gotten to the complete bottom of that, but I hope to show the progression of that by discussing the science a little bit too.
Yeah, I think you did such a good job with the science, and that is something, like, you know, I joke like I'm so not very sciencey, but I wrote a book with a lot of science in it too, but I was trying really hard to get like the 17 magazine versions, you know, like really, and I feel like you really nail that. Like, I think this is one of those books you read and you feel smarter, you know, as you're like, oh, I'm really smart because I understood that complicated idea. So I guess I was wondering, is this a space you feel comfortable, like writing the science in a way that sort of feels accessible?
Well, I've been a generalist for so long that I've been always excited to learn something new. I've written science stories in the past and even psychiatry stories in the past, but I don't consider myself a specialist. It was exciting to be able to delve into something new this way and try to write about it in layperson's terms. It also was scary too. I talked to a million experts and had a million people review everything to make sure that I wasn't screwing it up. But the goal here was not to, I mean, your book's amazing. Everyone here should read The Family Gene, by the way. It's wonderful. But the problem with journalists writing books about unfamiliar subjects is they often want to retail their research. They want to flaunt it. They want to say to readers, look at everything I've learned. Look at this fun fact that's out there. And I was afraid that that's what I would do here. And so I tried very hard to make sure that anytime I was writing about the science, it was in the service of this family story, that it upped the stakes for the family, so that you would come away from a passage about the science of mental illness and think, oh man, this makes what's happening to the Galvin family even more interesting to me. Now I really want to know what's happening with them. That was my sort of guidepost as I was going. The guy who really does this best is Michael Lewis, when he folds in technical information at just the right time to up the stakes in his narrative. So I try to do it a little like that. Yeah.
I love that. So this is maybe like a little bit controversial, but I felt like some of the time, and this is partially because back to my idea that you were kind of in Lindsay's point of view, you came down a little hard, it felt like, on some of the other siblings, the healthy or the well siblings, that you, as you call them. And like, I felt like Margaret sort of, you know, she wasn't really there and I'm just curious, like, did she and some of the brothers, did they feel like that was the right do they feel like you got that right? Or do you think that they were a little defensive about it?
Margaret's in a very interesting position in this family, because I should say, first of all, this book wouldn't have happened without her. She was the one who really had been thinking about the best way to tell this story for decades. But that story also was very much her own recovery story. And so by the time I got involved, it became a much broader palette to work with. But she's in the beginning, when I first met over the phone, in my first phone call, it was with the two sisters. And I came away thinking, well, maybe this will be a book about two sisters who survive a difficult family, a difficult childhood, and who help one another all the way through, who become each other's, you know, great helpmeets throughout this horrible, horrible childhood. But then very, very quickly, once I blasted off and started reporting, I learned that they were very different women, that they quite often were each other's great help, but they also had very different takes on their childhoods and their families, that sometimes they clashed, that things were very different for them. And I was sad about that briefly, but then I thought about it a little more and I thought, well, this is real. I mean, this is the way many families work. I have a brother and a sister, and we don't, between the three of us, we don't always agree on what our families like and what our childhoods were like. And so this is a chance for readers to hear about different experiences and actually wonder which one they fully identify with. And in the case of Hidden Valley Road, I'll just be playing with the people on the Zoom who haven't looked at the book. I mean, you have one sister who dives back into the family eventually after wanting to escape it and becomes the person who takes care of the sick brothers, and another who wants to escape the family and eventually sort of returns on her own terms, but creates distance, which creates a little bit of out of self-preservation, she does this for understandable reasons, but it creates a gulf with other family members. And so I tried my best not to be judgmental, and my hope was that readers could read this and wonder, am I more of a Margaret or am I more of a Lindsay? And then that question I think gets even more intriguing, because I think all of us are both, a little bit of both. And there was one woman who emailed me. I've been getting a lot of emails from people who have schizophrenia and their families. And she said directly, like, at some periods of my life, I've been more like Margaret, and at other periods of my life, I've been more like Lindsay. So that, to me, it turned out to be a very useful way of thinking about how to process trauma. Different people do it in different ways.
Yeah, and I think, and the two girls were the last two children, so and they're close in age. My sister and I think, are the same, distance apart, and we lost our mother a couple of years ago. And you were kind of probably sort of seeing them at this really complicated time when maybe things were a little, I don't know, high energy, high.
Right, like when you're in middle age and your parents are fading, all the focus is on them, and then once they're gone, what do you do? Like, what is your relationship to your siblings once your parents are gone? Are you still a family? These are questions that the sisters are encountering toward the end of the book, and the other people in the family are as well.
Yeah, and I just to go back to my question, I do think I thought you were very compassionate about everybody, and there was an honesty about that family. Was so complicated. Like, for example, there's a scene in the beginning where you describe Donald as a teenager, the oldest son, who was beginning to show pretty severe symptoms of schizophrenia, and you had this beautiful, chilling line that he was a mischief maker, a bully, and an instigator of chaos. And like, the parents would leave him as sort of he was the de facto babysitter, and one of the thoughts I had was sort of, certainly through the 80s, there was sort of this unparented population, right? Which now I think has been corrected, maybe overcorrected in some ways. But I'm wondering, do you feel like Mimi and Don, the parents, were particularly like lax in their parenting, even more than what was normal?
Well, I think a lot of it was generational, like let the kids do what they do, as long as they go to church on Sunday, it's okay. And then a lot of it is a lack of at no point did they think, well, maybe our children are showing the early signs of acute mental illness. Let's bring them to psychiatrists, because that's not what happens in the 50s or early 60s. And then a lot of it is caught up in their own vanity and their hope that, that they are this amazing family of 12 children that is relatively famous in their community. So they're kind of into it. So there's some of that. Mm-hmm. And then there's a boys will be boys suggestion. Like, yeah, we have kids and they fight a lot. Like, is that a problem, or is that a developmental stage? And so they were willing to believe the best in the situation and kind of pretend that the worst wasn't happening and let it ride. They decided to let it ride. And the worst possible things happened as a result of it.
We actually have a question from somebody. I think I'm supposed to wait officially, but it seems like it's in this what we're talking about now. So I'll just ask you. It says, it's from Renee, and it says, can you please discuss how you came to understand Mimi's denial and defense of dealing with and managing her children, either mentally ill or not? And can you also she wants you to also speak to Don's depression and autistic characteristics, and how you understood that impact on the family.
Yeah, I'll start with Mimi. I mean, Mimi to me is a very complicated character, and I was concerned about pigeonholing her and making her the villain of the book, because I think mothers get a really hard time in fiction and nonfiction alike. They often become like the ones who are, I think about like ordinary people or whatever. Like it's all mom's fault, and I didn't want it to be that easy, and it certainly isn't that easy with this family. When I first met the sisters and then talked to other people in the family, particularly Michael, they all were very critical of their mother. But at the same time, as adults, they realized that they had come around and broadened their perspectives and realized, first of all, how little context she had, how no one in that generation would have been ready for the horrible things that were visited upon her. And that secondly, they saw how she had kept the family together despite it all. She had championed her 6 sons and had gotten help for them. So she's a mixed bag, and I wanted to present her that way. I think the first half of the book's very hard on her, and the second half is a little broader, and I think that reflects the perspective of people when they were children, judging their parents, and then growing up and becoming parents themselves and having a new way of looking at their mother. And throughout, she's the same. Her tunnel vision and her denial become tools for her. Sometimes they're very negative tools, where she doesn't seek the proper help for her 6 sons. And then once the worst tragedies happen in this book, she turns on a dime, and all she does is address the needs of her 6 sons at the expense of the well children. And that's a form of denial as well too. And even talking to her in her final years, she was, as one of her daughters said, she's not very good at talking about her emotions, but she's very good at talking about how well the rice has been cooked. Like, she wants things to look good. She wanted things to be nice. A sick son like Peter will come to visit her, and she'll say, "Oh, you haven't had a shower in 2 days, and your belt isn't on right." And the other people around her will be like, "Really, Mom? That's the important thing. Like, he's here, he's around." But that's who she was. She was true to herself and to the end. And without her, this family never would have been studied by science. It never would have been a family. She was the only one keeping them together. So I enjoyed that complexity in writing about her.
Yeah, you did an incredible job, because I know you're going to tell us about Dawn in a second, but that was one of the things I really loved, is that I felt like I feel like I know so much about Mimi that it was hard to judge her, because you were like, oh, I get that. Like I understand where she's coming from, even in experience. So beautiful job with that.
Yeah, that's the shot I had here, given the amount of access I ended up having, was to write a book that could be a multi-generational family saga, where all of part 1 would be one generation, and all of part 2 could be the next generation. So you'd really know everybody by the time things happen to them. And that part of it was intimidating at first, and then thrilling to see that I could do that I had enough material to be able to do it. Don's a little trickier because he died a long time ago. He also receded from a position of authority in the family once he had a stroke in the 70s. So his real period of vitality was in the 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s. And I wasn't around for that. So there was a lot of reporting to be done about him, and a lot of trying to push as hard as I could to try to bring him alive on the page when he was around. But he certainly ended up becoming dependent on Mimi once he had his stroke. And before that, he was sort of the star of the family, this titan, this intellectual giant who everyone idolized. And so that was an interesting way of looking at him. And then, of course, Mimi knew things about him that no one else did, about infidelities and mental breakdowns. So that these become revelations that turn up later in the book, making him much more complex as well.
I agree. Yeah. So I just want to talk a little bit about Brian. I'm actually a little bit curious just about that whole story. So Brian is the son that like the biggest, arguably the biggest tragedy was his story. and you sort of introduce him in this way, like you kind of have a crush on him, like he's so, I mean, like the reader has a crush on him, and he's, you know, because he's very handsome and he's a musician and he's cool, and then you know, he has this relationship and he ends up murdering her and killing himself. Is it okay that I gave that away? I think it's like pretty okay. Sorry, too late. So there it is. But I was curious. I know that you mentioned that the young woman that died, that was killed, there was one person that had ever known her still living from her family. Is that why you didn't give her sort of a bigger, like she's in there and I think she's a great, you know, she's there, but like, do you think, I don't know, has there been a thought that maybe she should have had a bigger part in the book? I know that it wasn't the central part of the book. That wasn't the main thing, but.
I think at the very minimum, I had to make it clear that a life was lost here, that was just an unspeakable tragedy, and to make it just sort of send the message that she needs to be remembered. The hard part was that there were few people out there to talk to about it. You know, there's a man who had been married to her sister, who is not, the sister's now deceased, but the man had a good memory of her. But everybody else is gone. And then I was very lucky to talk to some people who went to high school with her, but the problem with that is that she was only at that high school for a year. So she didn't have lasting connections with anyone there as well. And then I was able, to me, the big victory was finding police reports and news coverage of her death, because the family, the Galvin family, I mean, still had no real definitive information about exactly what happened to Brian and the girlfriend. They still were trading around stories about whether it was a suicide pact or a bad LSD trip or a misadventure of some sort. But it's very, very clear from the news coverage and from the police reports that, you know, they had broken up. She was living alone. You know, he came in with a gun that he had bought the day before, killed her, shot himself. Like there's no, and he had a prescription to Navain, which is an antipsychotic. So it all kind of settles whatever uncertainty the family had about what had really happened there. It's just terribly tragic.
Yeah. So I had a question. This is more, and you a little bit talk about it, but I know that the idea that psychedelics, because you talk a little bit about the drug use from some of the siblings, and I know that like psychedelics have often been blamed for triggering schizophrenia, or, you know, like being one of the things that could cause it or something like that. And I think that that's been definitively like proven that that's not the case. But is that right? Am I right that is not for sure like it doesn't cause schizophrenia, drug use?
Yeah, I mean the latest notion is that anybody who has schizophrenia is born with a vulnerability to it, and that vulnerability can be potentially triggered by the environment. So so it's not like destiny. So it's a blueprint, but it doesn't necessarily manifest itself. So head trauma or drug use or child abuse, personal trauma, other things can all be sort of blamed for kind of setting you off in a tailspin that might trigger psychosis. And the problem with having a psychotic break is that then you're prone to having more psychotic breaks, and then you sort of go down that road. Whereas someone else who's born with the same genetic vulnerability, you know, wears a helmet during football practice, doesn't have the head trauma, perhaps doesn't develop acute mental illness in the same way. I mean, this is all a theory, but the vulnerability idea is what seems to be prevailing right now. So you could argue that people in the Galvin boys' generation took a lot of drugs, and that didn't do them any favors in terms of their potential to develop psychiatric problems. And at the same time, in hindsight, people look, the two sons had huge psychotic breaks after their significant others broke up with them. You know, another one was after witnessing his father have a stroke. You know, you can argue that there are all sorts of things that might trigger this genetic vulnerability.
Okay. Got it. All right, yeah, I do have a couple of questions about genetics, but it looks like we're getting a lot of questions over here, so I want to make sure all the ones that I really want to ask you, I've asked. You mentioned the nicotine drug because I thought it was fascinating, the point that you know, people who there are a lot of people with schizophrenia who smoke heavily, that's like there's some disproportionate percentage of people, and that there was a doctor who suspected maybe nicotine might actually alleviate some symptoms and then found that to be true. And then it sounded like that study got stopped, or the pharmaceutical companies sort of backed off. Is that still the case, or is that, I don't know, is there any hope for that to come back?
It's potentially exciting, but it's sad that the big pharma kind of stopped because whatever drugs they had tried to develop were causing some side effects, some digestive side effects in early trials. The larger problem with any possible new drug is that you can't test it on rats because rats don't get schizophrenia. So you have to test it on humans. That's risky, that's expensive, and you already have thorazine and clozapine and these psychoactive drugs that manage symptoms okay, so there isn't a huge clamoring to get something better, and that's the real tragedy. But as far as the nicotinic receptor idea, it's fascinating. The doctor who I write about, Dr. Robert Friedman, he isolates a part of the brain where he thinks sensory gating issues, sensory processing issues are regulated. The theory being, like what you might have seen in A Beautiful Mind, is that, you know, somebody who has schizophrenia has trouble filtering everything, all the stimuli that's coming out, and sometimes has delusions and freaks out. And so the other idea, and he finds a part of the brain, a receptor that's a nicotinic receptor, and then he sees that a lot of schizophrenia patients, including Peter Galvin, are chain smokers. And he thinks, well, they're smoking because it settles them down. It helps them focus. It helps them put those delusions at bay for a very brief period of time. So he does a study where he gives a lot of schizophrenia patients a bunch of pieces of Nicorette gum, and he does measurements, and sure enough, it's helpful to them. And so then he thinks, what if there's a drug that can medicate this? And he comes up and he finds a drug that is unfortunately already owned by a university, so no big pharmaceutical company can make big money off of it. And they have to go and reinvent the wheel and come up with something just like it, and then it has side effects, and then it all kind of peters out, and it's a shame. It's a real shame. The only upside is that it leads him in another direction, which helps him try to reinforce that same part of the brain in utero for kids who might have genetic vulnerabilities. And he suggests that expectant mothers take a nutritional supplement called choline, which you can get at any vitamin shop, which can strengthen your resilience and perhaps stave off mental illness.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, it is so interesting, everything that's happening with genetics. And you have, there's a wonderful quote by Harold Varmus that you put in here, who is the former NIH, National Institutes of Health director. He said, if you're not studying genes, you're going to be dinosaurs. And so I feel like that's sort of now true of schizophrenia and also other mental health. I mean, so many disorders, so many things. But do you still think that's true?
Well, the Human Genome Project gave people a lot of hope when Harold Varmus said that in the 90s. And the idea was that if you sequence the human genome and you know what a so-called normal human gene situation looks like, and you stack it up on a computer against somebody who has an illness, you can find the culprit gene in 10 seconds, and then you'll be done by dinner time. Like you'll have figured out what to target with the drug. But the problem is that while it worked for some very genetically simple illnesses, with complex illnesses, it only muddied the waters even more. With schizophrenia, they found one gene that was a player, according to these genome studies. And then they found another and another and another, until now they have way more than 100 possible genes, all contributing just a teeny tiny bit to one's susceptibility to developing schizophrenia. So it just makes things even more confusing. So that even the genetic thing is complicated.
All right, so I'm going to ask you some questions from the audience, the invisible, our invisible audience. Mary Beth asks, do you know, and you do address this in the book, so I know the answer, but do you know if there have been any family members with mental illnesses in the youngest generation?
Hi, Mary Beth. Thank you for asking. The youngest generation is addressed toward the end of the book. There's a lot of anxiety about them, obviously, because the inheritance pattern of schizophrenia is so unpredictable. It's not like it goes from parent to child. It kind of wanders and meanders. There's been good news so far with this youngest generation. I don't think it's a spoiler to say that people are all right, but the way that the family has monitored them is a very interesting part of the story.
Yeah, love that. And then Paige would like to know your thoughts as to why 6 of the siblings developed schizophrenia, but 6 didn't.
That's a question they all ask themselves, all the Wells siblings. They wonder why them and not someone else. That Lindsay has that question in particular because she feels like she had a lot of trauma in her childhood, and that her brothers who became sick also had trauma, and she wonders, well, how did I get past that and not them?
Because she also has some of the markers, right? She has some of the genetic markers as well.
It seems that way. So she feels that, and I think today's specialists would agree with her, that she had a lot of early interventions, that she had a lot of early, at a relatively young age, say like as soon as she was in college, she started going to intense therapy and really, really working hard to address her issues, as if to stave off a crisis like what her brothers might have had. She believes, and actually a lot of people believe now, that if you can really push hard early on with strange symptoms in your teenage years, that you can stave off psychotic breaks, and maybe with a little help of medicine as well as therapy, really prevent the worst stuff from happening and leading to a more functional life. So then of course she had a son who she ended up, when she saw that he was behaving strangely, she threw the kitchen sink of therapy at him too. And she likes to think that if her brothers had gotten something like that at that age, that they might have been better off too.
Yeah, but he's still fairly young, right? Her son is still pretty young.
Yeah, he's like 18 or 19.
I thought that moment at the end, I don't think it's a spoiler, but where her daughter goes into the lab and has that experience with her grandfather's brain was just incredible. Like what a beautiful, I don't know, it was just felt like you wrote it so beautifully. So.
Yeah, if the book feels too bleak to anybody on the Zoom, there are shards of hope in there somewhere with certain people in the next generation, for sure.
Oh, for sure. So I think it's probably pronounced Cecily would like to know what, if any, was the correlation in this story between the sexual abuse and the schizophrenia?
That was a very delicate situation. There is one brother in particular who was sexually abusive to his sisters, and the modern thinking on this is that they aren't related, that schizophrenia does not cause pedophilia. Pedophilia does not cause schizophrenia. This is just not if that were the case, there'd be way, way more instances of it. It just is a horrible situation that this one brother, Jim, not only was developing mental illness, but he also was physically abusive to his wife and eventually to his son, and sexually abusive to both of his sisters. And so I had to be very clear about that in the book to make it clear that it didn't seem like it was a function of his delusions or anything like that. It was simply a problem with him. There is a theory that perhaps he was abused sexually by a priest. None of that's proven, but that feels like a possible explanation for why he grew up to become an abuser. Of course, life is complicated and it's hard to know exactly where such a thing comes from.
Right. No, I thought you handled that whole section. I thought that was really interesting, and I mean, there were a lot of things that happened in that family that were complicated by a lot of different things, and I thought you kind of managed to get them all into this book, so that was amazing to me. So Carolyn would like to know, she says, President Obama wanted to devote a study about the brain as had been done with the genome. Oh, so like maybe a similar mapping of the brain. How do you think could this tie in with the study of schizophrenia? I mean, if you've heard of it, and what is your hope for the research in that area?
I think the best thing that that the genomic studies of schizophrenia can do is kind of shine a light at the parts of the brain that are players as far as when schizophrenia takes shape in the brain, when it manifests itself. Because we know now that there isn't one magic gene that we can drug or medicate that will solve this problem. But if we can know how exactly this illness manifests itself, how it functions inside the brain, then we can really go to work on trying to mitigate it or treat it once it happens or prevent it from happening. So I think such a study would be invaluable in the context of this illness. I should point out that it's not, many people in the Zoom might know this already, but schizophrenia isn't really an illness. It's a syndrome. It's a collection of symptoms that we've given a name. It's not like COVID-19 where we know at a molecular level what it is. It's merely a classification. So a few generations from now, the word schizophrenia might not even exist, and there might be 5 or 6 different brain disorders that we have cut it out into that are all a little different from one another.
Interesting. Several people have asked about the Gearys. This was the family that took in both of the girls at different points, right? They each lived with them at some point, and they were good family friends. So this person wants to know, did you ever speak to them directly?
Yes, I spoke with Nancy and a little bit with Sam, but a lot with Nancy. Sam's more like around 90, whereas Nancy's around 80. So Sam's memory isn't what it was. Mm-hmm. They're a fascinating family, a very generous family, but they've had their own tragedy in their lives as well, but it doesn't seem to have slowed them down. It's almost like something out of Charles Dickens, the way that they kind of, airlift one child out of this family to save her from being in the middle of this chaos, and then help another sister get to boarding school, and then become their benefactors years down the line as well. It's really quite dramatic and quite something. And it's nice that the family is still close to them as well. But
it's also, like a complicated emotions, right? It's a complicated relationship, it sounds like.
Yeah, because it seems like the Garys and the older generation of the Galvins, Don and Mimi, that they were friends for a very long time, but then perhaps not so close. So the fact that they help the children is a little complicated. But the whole thing is very, very tricky. The way that anyone who, if you had a friend who was way, way wealthier than you and was in a position to really help you, it complicates the friendship. And so the way that the Gary family reacted, both grateful and a little unnerved by the whole experience, that they were so vulnerable when they, for a period there, the Galvin family, they were rock stars, right? In Colorado Springs, and then they were really in need. And so being vulnerable wasn't their favorite position to be in.
Yeah. The person who asked that question, I can't remember their name and it's not there anymore, but they also were curious if the Gearys are still funding studies. I think you say that they are, but yeah.
Yeah, Nancy's involved in, this is one of the great coincidences of the book, that Robert Friedman at the University of Colorado Hospital had been treating the Galvin family, and it just so happens that Nancy is a benefactor in Dr. Friedman's work going forward. And it really isn't because of the Galvin family connection, it's just because. And
oh, that's so funny.
It's like a total small town kind of situation. But yeah, she thinks Friedman walks on water. She's ready to fund anything he does, for sure.
Yeah. Let's see. So this person also wanted to know about the Gearys, and that they're wondering, Lisa, she's wondering if they had any personal experience with mental illness in the Gearys family, and also how they chose to, or ended up caring for Margaret in the beginning, but not Lindsay.
Nancy Gary got a graduate degree in psychology. So she's interested in it from a kind of professional point of view. A lot of their they have like 8 kids themselves, and a lot of them had a genetic illness that was not psychiatric in nature, but it was tragic, that years later ended up killing some of their children. But there was one child of the Garys that ended up at the Menninger clinic for a short time, which is a very high-priced clinic. And the suspicion is that perhaps she had schizophrenia, but that's not something that Nancy really talks about much. So it's possible that it's coming from a personal place with her, but she isn't really chatting about it. And her what was the back part of that question? There was the
and the other part was, how did they end up caring for Margaret but not taking Lindsay?
I think that I think they chose the daughter who was old enough to go to the Kent Denver school, which was the school that their kids went to. That I guess the rationalization was that the younger sister, Lindsay, didn't have, there was no place to send her if she did go there. So they said, just send us Margaret and we'll put her in school.
Yeah, and also like lightening the load was even being able to lighten the load was something.
Yeah. But it was deeply weird. Lindsay never understood it. Years later, they said to her that they thought that she was the tougher of the two and that maybe she was gonna be okay, whereas Margaret was really in distress. That might have been in hindsight. It's an interesting thing to think about, though, that perhaps they sensed that Lindsay was more resilient.
So Elizabeth would like to know, and she's a psychiatrist, she'd like to know, was there a plan to follow the younger generations moving forward, either by you or by the NIMH?
The group on the East Coast that really did the genomic sequencing of the Galvins, that's Dr. Lynn DeLisi and her partner, who at the time was with Amgen and is now at Pfizer. They are willing to continue looking at any kind of family like the Galvins, including the Galvins, going forward. They would love to continue that work. They are without a major sponsor at the moment. Stephen McDonough, who's at Pfizer, who worked with Dr. DeLisi, he's willing to keep doing it on his off hours, but it's not like Pfizer is necessarily interested in going full throttle on a drug at the moment. So it's all a little kind of like a side hustle for those doctors at the moment. And the book kind of beats the drum for how families like the Galvins are far more important than that and deserve a lot more attention than that.
I feel like, and this is, Elizabeth has another question, but I actually have spoken to her a little bit about, I know that there was going to be a meeting of psychiatrists, and they were going to talk specifically about schizophrenia this year, as I recall. And it was in large part because of what was happening with, politically, with this idea, we're not going to deal with gun laws, we're going to deal with mental health, right? So does that change what you're saying? Like, do you think there will be funding down the road for some of these studies?
It certainly makes sense. I mean, there's a very popular study that's already 8 or 9 or 10 years old that suggests that it kind of looks back on all of the school shootings that had happened up until that point, and it suggests that in a large number of those cases, the people who were the shooters had been manifesting what looks like early signs of mental illness. Now that's all hindsight, and nobody sat on the couch and analyzed these people, but it's this compelling idea that if we had better mental health treatment in this country, that we would have fewer incidents like that. And certainly it would be cost effective. And Dr. Friedman in Hidden Valley Road, he actually says straight out that he believes this. And also he points out that, and the National Institute of Mental Health spends like pennies on prevention and jillions on treatment. And so what have you just tried to balance that even just a little bit? Like, what could we do with that? So I think that certainly it would be wonderful to have that sort of momentum.
All right, so last thing from Elizabeth, I thought this is really nice. She writes this: I'm a psychiatrist and want to thank you for writing this book in such a way that portrays both this family and schizophrenia as an illness in a humanistic, compassionate way and not in an exploitive way. So many of the children came in and out of the home throughout their lives. And then she was wondering, was that what led you to name the book Hidden Valley Road over another title? I actually was wondering about the title myself, so good question.
So much of their story was about a period in America and in the world where you would hide a problem like this, where you would be in denial about it, where half of the psychiatrists were blaming mothers for mental illness. The schizophrenic mother was this prevailing theory at the time. The other half wanted to institutionalize and use shock therapy and heavy duty meds to get rid of the children and put them out of sight. So the family kept it all a secret. So that the fact that they lived on a street named Hidden Valley Road was irresistible. Like there was no way I was not going to name the book Hidden Valley Road.
Yeah. So Jean was wondering, we have a couple more questions, we can maybe get them all, but did this family have a history of schizophrenia in previous generations, or like cousins, like other distant family members?
Let's see, Don had 2 brothers. One of those brothers had a couple kids, and one of them had schizophrenia it turned out, so the next generation. So that was interesting. I've learned only recently from far-flung relatives on the mother's side of the family that there's somebody with schizophrenia off in the distance there. This isn't necessarily surprising. It really seems as if this illness really bounces around and bangs around and doesn't, almost really rarely goes from parent to child, but just sort of zips around and shows up unpredictably, even though it's quite clearly has a genetic component. So it's quite befuddling.
So Pat has a great question too. She says, or they say, I read this book at night and found a way into my dreams every time I did.
Whoa.
How did you take care of your mental health while writing this book? That's a great question.
This was my second book. My first book was very traumatic, and I don't want to understate the trauma of the people I was writing about, because it was about people going through way worse stuff than me. But it was tough for me. And in hindsight, I look back and I think one reason why it was so traumatic is that I was kind of white knuckling it. I was putting on a brave face to everybody around me and saying, everything's fine, I'm writing a book, it should be fine. But I was treating it like I was on a roller coaster ride, and as soon as the ride was over, I'd be okay. So with this book, I made a deal with myself at the beginning, which was that I was going to treat it like I was having a life, that it wasn't this crazy, aberrant moment in my life, that this was my work. I was doing my work. So I wanted to have balance. So I took a cooking class at night, and we got a dog because I was working from home on the book. It was the right time for the family to get a dog. Like I tried to broaden my life a little bit so that it wasn't just about this and that. And most of all, I didn't white knuckle it. I shared pieces of the book with friends of mine and really made it not like it was just a me against the world situation. And that was great too. It became this thing where I could share it with other people and they could help me make the book better, which was wonderful.
Love it. Michael wants to know, how long did it take you to write it? I know you said it took you a year of research, but what about actually just writing it?
So after that year, I got the book deal in the middle of 2017 and handed over a very, very rough draft a year and a half later, and then did heavy revisions for another year or so. And then of course, finalizing it to get it out the door. So I would say 3 years plus the year of talking to the family and getting the whole idea solid.
All right, so there's 2 more I'm gonna ask you quickly. This one I'm actually curious about too. So Mary Beth again heard a hypothesis that schizophrenia might be exacerbated by animal feces. And she's wondering if there were falcons in the house, or were they gone by the time the girls were born, and if maybe that could have played some kind of role.
And so the cat litter thing's interesting. There was a book, I don't know, 5 years ago with somebody who really was pushing hard on that. It's a bit of a canard. It doesn't seem to have a lot of momentum. I did sit down with one of the great titans of schizophrenia research, a guy named E. Fuller Torrey, who wrote Surviving Schizophrenia. He's up in years now, but he's still working. And I met with him in person in Washington, and we're talking. And it turns out that he thinks that toxoplasmosis actually could possibly be something, although he has no data to support it. And so we're chit-chatting about it. And then suddenly I start to think what Mary Beth thought. I thought, oh my God, this family was a falcon family. I I stop whatever he's saying and I go, they had falcons all over the house. Could this have been a falcon thing? And almost immediately he said, no, it's nothing about falcons, not about birds or anything like that. So I said, oh, okay, all right. So I kind of walked away from that idea. That would be something though, for sure.
Well, Nancy wants to know, did the schizophrenia, like who does it primarily affect? Is there an age component? Is it male, female? Who is it random? Like who does it mostly impact?
In this family, it would seem to suggest that it's a male thing, but that doesn't seem to be the case in the general population. It seems like that males might have a slight edge over females, but it's nothing significant. It seems to manifest itself. What's that?
In different ages. It seems like they all kind of got it different times in their life.
Yeah. For most people, it's the end of adolescence. It seems to be when the final coat of paint is going on your brain. Like when you're finally putting everything together, that's when whatever shortcomings there were from the very beginning start to become obvious, and you aren't developing the way that others are. So for most people, it's their early 20s or around then. There is one child in the Gavin family who was 14, but everybody else is sort of in their between 18 and 25 when they had their first big psychotic break. So it's sort of in line with what people believe happens.
All right, I'm going to read you Anna's question. It's really nice. And then I think you kind of already answered her question, so we'll skim over that. But she says she's another psychiatrist. She's a child psychiatrist, in fact. And she echoes and appreciates how you provided a narrative in a way that helped us understand this family from a child's point of view, which is true. And she thanks you for talking about prevention and how money spent there may be well worth our efforts. And so she was wondering, and we kind of talked about this, but does the time you spent researching the book change how you think about psychiatric illness might approach the future, either personally or professionally?
Certainly. I think that when you're unfamiliar with an illness like this, you tend to think that the people are lost and that forsaken, and that it's just too hard to even look at closely. And why not go and work on something a little easier, like depression or anxiety? And I think that what I've learned from my experience is that I feel like all of these illnesses are like dominoes that are slowly falling, that over the last 40 years, bipolar illness, depression, anxiety, and even autism have come out from the cold, and people talk about them now like conditions and not like secrets that you have to keep. And that schizophrenia could be the last one to really enter the public, and it might be the hardest one to mainstream, because the people who have it seem so foreign to us. But one of my hopes with a book like this is, and certainly the family's hope in being public, is that becomes less and less the case, and that there's less and less of a stigma.
Well, thank you so much. I have to say, reading this book, I kept Googling everybody. Margaret's artwork is amazing. I mean, just like you want to know more, you want to see them, and you brought them to life so beautifully. And the book itself is just gorgeous. I'm so excited for your next book. So thank you so much, Bob. It was really lovely talking to you. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. These are great questions, everybody. I'm just thrilled to be able to talk about it.
All right, Linda, back to you.
Thank you for your wonderful questions, Joselin. And I encourage all of you in the audience to tell your friends about Hidden Valley Road. Such a beautifully written and insightful book. For those of you who haven't yet had a chance to read Bob's gripping story, I know you will want to now. Thank you again, Bob and Joselin, for an incredible and illuminating conversation. Just from the questions, you can see how engaged this audience has been. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. And thanks to all of you viewers for joining us this evening. and for your thought-provoking questions. I want to remind you real quickly of the links at in your chat box with registration to upcoming Gramercy live streamed events on July 21st, our author night with Sarah Menkendick, July 23rd, the book club with Mary Doria Russell and the Women of Copper Country, and then on the 25th of August with Jill McCorkle and Hieroglyphics. We've also added a link if you'd like to purchase a copy of Hidden Valley Road for yourself, for your parent, for your husband, wife, sibling, or friend. Thank you again for joining us at Gramercy Books, and enjoy the rest of your evening.